Welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Mark Turman, the Executive Director of Denison Forum, sitting down again with Jim Denison, the CEO of Denison Ministries and cultural apologist with Denison Forum. Jim, how are you today?
Doing well today. Mark, how are you?
Doing great. It's an exciting morning for us. Going back even 6 or 8 months when I joined Denison Ministries, Denison Forum full-time, we started talking about doing a podcast, and really the inspiration for that, for me anyway, was to have conversations like we're going to have today with the kind of thought leaders that we're going to talk to today. We're excited today to have a conversation with David French, who is probably known to many on our podcast audience. I know I came to know the name David French through you, Jim, going back, 4 or 5 years ago at least, in your references to him in terms of articles and things that you had read or heard. And I heard the name enough that I started pursuing it on my own and have become an avid follower of the Dispatch where David works. I have also read a number of his articles that come out in newsletter form, and most recently have become an avid follower of the Good Faith podcast, which is actually kind of a bridge to this conversation. I was driving back from Houston, seeing my perfect grandchildren, a few weeks ago.
As are mine.
And was listening to David French and Curtis Chang on the Good Faith podcast, and they were interviewing a guy named Jonathan Charks. And I was like, there's only got to be one family named Charks in the world. And I know a Charks who works in our ministry.
Right.
And I started making some contacts, and I said, hey, Melissa is her name. Hey, that was your Jonathan, right? And she said, absolutely it was. And that helped facilitate the conversation today. Let me introduce David, and then he can say a word of greeting as well.
Or defense, as the case may be.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Right. David French is a senior editor at the Dispatch and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. A graduate of Harvard Law School, David was previously a senior writer for National Review and a columnist for Time. He is a former constitutional litigator and a past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. David is a New York Times bestselling author, and his most recent book, which we'll get into a little bit today, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. That book was released this past September. David is a former major in the United States Army Reserve and is a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. David, it is my thrill to welcome you to the Denison Forum podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor. I really appreciate it.
Well, David, just so you know, when we started out with the podcast strategy and we started asking who could be some guests that we would love to have on the conversation, you were at the top of the list. You were number one on the list. So we are thrilled to be in this conversation with you, delighted for what you do, what you've done to serve our country, what you do to serve the cause of Christ, and just the brilliance with which you really help us engage the culture effectively. So we're huge fans and so grateful to you for giving us this time today. Really grateful to you.
Oh, that's so kind of you, and really happy to be here.
Well, thank you. Well, let me begin, if I could, by talking with you about a scenario that really in many ways is in light of the Supreme Court leak that is dominating the news today. In just a bit, I'd love to get you to respond to that more from a legal perspective, using your legal expertise at that point. And also in a bit, we're going to talk about abortion a little bit itself. What would it mean? What would it mean if Roe falls? What are the consequences for us in that context? So we'll get to that in just a bit first. But there's a larger scenario behind this that I wanted to get to for just a moment. One of the many, many reasons I've been so grateful for your work is the spirit in which you do it. We as a ministry are all about Ephesians 4:15. It's kind of our mantra, speaking the truth in love. We say quite often, I said to a group yesterday, we're not here to be cultural warriors, we're to be cultural missionaries. That, as our friend John Stonestreet says, ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. The other side is not the enemy. That actually in the spiritual context, Satan is the enemy. And we need to be building bridges of relationship. We ought to be about conciliation, and we ought to be about, as a democracy, working toward a kind of pluralism that you so defend and so articulate. So I'm completely with you there. We are absolutely of one mind in that context. At the same time, I'm imagining some friends of mine who disagree, who would say, to be specific in a political context, that let's just be candid about this, even though this sounds partisan, that we needed to elect Donald Trump in 2016 because he would nominate justices to the Supreme Court who would overturn Roe v. Wade. And while, yes, he's not the Sermon on the Mount character I wish he were, he's the Romans 13, wield the sword of the state sort of leader that we had to have to face down Iran and North Korea, whatever, but especially for the court, especially with regard to abortion. And now if Roe falls, as the Alito leaked memo might suggest, if that does turn out to be what the court decides, and we know that may not be the case, then by conservative estimate, as many as 88,000 lives every year could be saved if Roe were to fall, depending on how you do the numbers and all that. So weren't we right? Don't we need to be culture warriors? Don't we need to be aggressors? Don't we need to be taking on the other side for the sake of life? Second issue would be religious liberty, and that could be the Equality Act and all that's inside that. They're coming after our civil rights. We now have to be aggressors to the culture in a way that I don't want to be and haven't tried to be, that isn't our spirit. Can we talk about that for just a bit? What are your thoughts in the context of how to position ourselves relative to cultural engagement?
Well, the first thing you have to do is we can't sit here and say, well, I'm against this politician, because I did not support, just full disclosure, I did not support Trump in 2016 or Hillary, and I did not support Trump in 2020 or Biden. So I didn't support either major party candidate in 2016 or 2020. But we can't get this partisan mindset that says if something good happens because of a president I didn't support, that I'm going to find a way to say it's not good or to minimize it, right? So from day one, one of my positions on Trump was his judicial appointments are good. His judicial appointments are good. And they have, those judicial appointments, those judges have done some really good things. And if this draft Alito opinion holds, and we can talk about whether, what are the odds it'll hold and all of that later on. But if this draft Alito opinion holds, that's a really, really good thing that has occurred. Now, the problem that I have is with this. It is this idea that essentially says, okay, wait a minute, here's this issue, abortion. And if I take this issue, I'm going to say this issue is important enough, or religious liberty is important enough, to where a lot of the commands that exist in Scripture about how Christians should conduct themselves in the public square no longer apply. Okay? So I like to talk about Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you, a man? What is good? It is to act justly, to love mercy or love kindness, depending on the translation, and to walk humbly before the Lord your God. It does not say unless the stakes are high, right? If you're talking about the fruit of the Spirit, it's the fruit of the Spirit unless the stakes are high. Or we love your enemies unless your enemies are pro-abortion. I mean, there are none of these caveats. And think of it this way. If you're reading the New Testament, just let's pull the New Testament out for a minute. Every syllable written to the church and to Christians about loving your enemies, speaking the truth in love, was written at a time when Christians could not imagine the wealth and power we have today.
No doubt.
Couldn't imagine it. Like our religious liberty concerns, they would think that's hysterical that keeps us up at night.
Absolutely.
Right?
I've said that a lot about my Cuban friends who say the same thing. They would say, look, you're not persecuted. And you've made the point that we have more religious liberty than ever.
Persecuted.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't defend the American constitutional structure. In fact, I think that's part of our responsibilities as good citizens. And in fact, Congress has delegated to the American people through civil rights statutes sort of the ability to police our own constitutional structure. And so I've long defended America's constitutional structure. But no point when you're defending America's constitutional structure, whether I'm even litigating or whether I'm in politics, am I relieved from the obligations that you talk about loving your enemies, blessing those who persecute you, the fruit of the Spirit, Micah 6:8, none of those things. And so one of the things that troubled me during our last 4, 5, 6, 7 years has not been that there was a politician who did some good things or some bad things. That's, I think Trump had an unusually bad character, and we can go into a lot of the bad things that he did that I think really tore at the social fabric of this country in some pretty profound ways, where he left the country worse off than he inherited it. But the thing that bothered me was not that somebody, say, would vote for Trump. Look, these were hard calls. These were hard decisions. And And I don't think that we should sit here and say, well, here was the Christian thing to do in the voting booth, right? There's grace. We had hard decisions to make. But here's what really bothered me was when people would rationalize or defend or excuse conduct that they would not rationalize, defend, or excuse in anybody else. Or by one thing I noticed between 2016 and 2020 is some people went from sort of the hold your nose and vote approach to sort of the third boat in the boat parade. And not in spite of a lot of Trump's pugilism, but because of a lot of Trump's pugilism. They really loved that he took it to the quote unquote enemies of the church. And I've put it this way. If you are not to hate your enemies, you're not fulfilling that command to love your enemies by hiring someone to hate them for you. So, look, we can look at Trump and we can say policy A, B, or C we liked and was good. And I can look and say policy D, E, F, and G was not good. And I can also say his character was sadly dreadful, okay? And what we have to be able to do as Christians is remove ourselves from the partisan mindset enough to where we're not so much on team red or team blue that we can't tell the truth and can't feel like we can tell the truth or even be curious enough about the truth to know the truth sometimes about politicians we support or oppose. I'll give you an example. Some folks get so much in a media bubble that they don't even know what they don't know. I was talking to this super great Christian man that I've known for years and years and years, just one, salt of the earth person, very, 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 very Republican. And he was bemoaning the fact that political leaders lie so much. And he said, like Joe Biden lies. And I said, man, Joe Biden has said some things that aren't true. And so did our previous president. Trump, and he looks at me like I'd lost my mind. He couldn't believe that I would say that Donald Trump lied. But that's how deep into sort of the partisan bubble that he was. So yeah, I think with all political leaders, if they do something or make decisions that are good, that are just, we should celebrate it. But we can never rationalize away what is unjust or what is cruel or what is false or what is deceptive. And that was my problem in the last 5, 6, 7 years. It wasn't with Christians who were trying to accomplish good things. It was when Christians were rationalizing away evil or cruelty or malice that they would never excuse in anybody else.
So I agree, absolutely. And there is no condition. And our Cuban friends would say this, our Chinese friends would say this, our friends in parts of the Muslim world would say this, look, you are not facing persecution as we understand persecution here. So,
Right.
let's really get some context around all of this. So is there and I don't know the answer to this. I really don't. This is the opposite of a rhetorical question. Are there scenarios out there, whether it's abortion or religious liberty or something else, where we, without sacrificing the fruit of the Spirit, without sacrificing the command to love our enemies, where we are to be perhaps more aggressive, more militant, more militaristic, more engaged in an aggressive posture than perhaps I've been willing to be? Does that make sense?
It's a good question. And I would say, we do actually have a model in modern American life of a Christian political movement confronting extraordinary injustice in a Christ-like way. And that was the nonviolent civil rights movement,
Absolutely.
motivated by the philosophy of nonviolence. Okay. So that is seeing a situation of horrific injustice. The Jim Crow regime was a horrific injustice. You had, just to put it in perspective, in the United States of America, the land of the free, home of the brave, you had an apartheid substate in the southeastern United States. It was an apartheid state. And so you had this coalition of powerless people. I mean, American evangelicals kind of like to, it feels like we sort of have a bit of a persecution complex now. You want to know actual persecution?
Right.
If you were a Black American in the South.
No doubt.
Okay, that was actual horrific persecution. Yes. And what did they do? They responded with this philosophy of nonviolence, civil disobedience based on, and King would even say, and John Lewis would say that actually our civil disobedience is based on a high respect for the law, because we pay the penalty for what we've done to violate the law. We don't act in violence. And, it was one of the most successful social movements of all of American history. And it was not one based on cruelty or malice or punching your enemies in the face at all. At all. It was based on a notion of loving your enemies. It was a Micah 6:8 movement. And so when we look at that and we look at that extraordinarily successful movement seeking justice and that didn't forsake other Christian virtues, it can kind of in some ways put us to shame now when we approach the public square from a position of almost infinitely more power than, say, Rosa Parks had, right? And feel this sense of panic about the public square. And just to point on religious liberty, our religious liberty is not hanging by a thread.
Right.
Going back to before Trump, going back to the Obama era, there was a decade-long religious liberty winning streak at the Supreme Court, where most of the cases were decided by 6-3, 7-2, some of them 9-0. Religious liberty has never been stronger as a matter of legal doctrine than never in the history of the United States been stronger than it is today. Then it doesn't mean that people aren't taking aim at it. The way I've put it is that the walls of the citadel of liberty are really high and strong, but the cannon fire against it is real. It's just that the walls can easily repel it. And a lot of some of these cases that you see and read about, I know what the outcome is going to be. Those who are attacking religious liberty or free speech are going to fail. In fact, there was just a religious speech case, another one won at the Supreme Court this week.
I was going to bring that up. The Boston was written by 9-0.
Yeah, the Boston flag
9-0. Yeah. And the opinion was written by Justice Breyer, not a Trump appointee, by Justice Breyer. So religious liberty in this country is on very, very, very historically solid footing.
Are you concerned about the Equality Act, so-called Equality Act?
Not so much.
A scenario by which it becomes a law.
So as of right now, there's no ability for it to become law because it doesn't even have 50 Democratic votes. It doesn't have, as written, I don't think Joe Manchin supports it as written. They're not going to break the filibuster for it. And also the elements of the Equality Act that are particularly intrusive, many of them would be unconstitutional under current law.
That's my understanding.
I think the Equality Act, here's the way I'd put it, about 80 to 85 to 90% of the Equality Act is already law. After the Bostock decision, is pretty much already law. So employment discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation is unlawful now under the Bostock decision. And the implications of the Bostock decision radiate outside of employment. So the Equality Act much of it is kind of already in effect. Now, the part of the Equality Act I find particularly noxious is the element that would repeal RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to the extent that it conflicted with the Equality Act. And that seems directly aimed at religious free exercise. But religious free exercise isn't just protected by RFRA. It's primarily protected by the First Amendment. And the Equality Act can't repeal the First Amendment. And so it is a law. I don't support the law as written, but I'm not necessarily laying awake at night about the law.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's encouraging. That would have been what I hoped you would say and would have been my sense, but I certainly don't have the capacity you have to do that. So, well, Mark?
Well, David, I wanted to maybe pick up here off of your recent conversation with Curtis Chang about identity and being in a partisan post mindset, or getting away from the partisan mindset in this idea of identity. I wonder if there's an opportunity for our listeners, believers, to consider, because it has seemed that part of the reason, maybe a couple of reasons, why Christians and Christian leaders, particularly in talking and engaging in the political sphere, didn't come out against what was obviously unbiblical in leaders, whether it's Trump or others. The reason they didn't speak in some cases about those was because we're in this world where you have to be all the way in or all the way out. You can't say, hey, these are hard choices that we have to make, and here's the things that we need to be concerned about when it comes to this or that leader. We can be in favor of these policies or these positions, but we can't really go all in on any of these people as we understand them right now. But the way that our system is set up, you either have to be all in or all out.
Right.
And then coupled with that, something that I thought was really insightful in the recent good faith conversation about identity. This huge issue that our culture is struggling with, and how we assemble our sense of identity. And loved some of the conversation, if you could reflect on that a little bit, how Christians need to just anchor themselves in building a biblical Christ-formed identity as opposed to a culturally formed identity.
Yeah, that's two great themes. Let me start with the all in or all out part. So the all in or all out is really important to understand as a kind of a psychological dynamic of engaging in politics. So what ends up happening, and I'm going to use courtroom terms because I think it really is helpful for framing the way we approach things, is that once you sort of put on the red jersey or the blue jersey, once you become a support a Republican or support a Democrat, a lot of times your mindset changes to where you essentially become a lawyer for your side. You're like a free, unpaid lawyer for your side. And so what do lawyers do? Well, lawyers maximize and argue, they maximize the virtue of their client and they minimize the vice, right? So if I'm representing you guys in court and there's a jury, everything good you do, I'm going to talk that up. Everything negative, I'm going to rationalize away because I want the jury to have a picture of you. I want the jury to sort of see you in a bright, shining light. And then there's this other attorney on the other side who's doing the exact reverse. Everything bad about you, dredging and elevating, and everything good about you, minimizing. That is a kind of a tough way for Christians to interact with their fellow human beings. Part of it, in a courtroom setting with rules of evidence where there's a juror and fact finders and all of this, you're playing your role as part of a truth-seeking process. All of that is fine. In a situation where you're not in a courtroom and there's no rules of evidence, and essentially what ends up happening is you become in some ways almost without even realizing it or rather without even understanding it, often kind of inherently deceptive. Because what you're doing, you're maximizing the good of your side and you're minimizing the wrong, and you're trying to create you're casting a false picture. And why would you minimize the wrong? Because there's always someone in your ear saying, "Don't give ammunition to the other side."
Right.
Don't give ammunition to the other side. And so it drives you into this lawyer pose, which is a real problem. Because you should be a juror or a judge. You should be adjudicating what's right and wrong between competing sides, not putting on the lawyer clothes, the jersey, and stepping into the ring. Now, that doesn't mean you don't run for office. That doesn't mean you don't identify as a Republican. It's talking about more in that transition to that core identity. How do you see yourself? Where is it on the list of your identity markers? Where is that partisanship? Christian should be that should be the paramount identity marker. Husband, father, grandfather, all of those things are just so core. And then how far down do you have to go, if you even have to go far down at all, before you get to Republican or Democrat? And one of the things we talked about in the podcast is a warning sign of that you're deeply involved, you have a deep identity that's Republican or Democrat, is if you begin to start to have an involuntary negative reaction to people on the other side.
Right.
So if you meet Bob, and Bob has come to, repair your air conditioner, and you're a Democrat and Bob's got a MAGA hat on, do you have an instant negative reaction? Or if you're a Republican and Bob has a Biden hat on, do you have an instant negative reaction? Well, you should know at that moment that something about your political identity has wormed its way too deeply into you. And so what is that involuntary reaction that you have? And here's another one. We know from, research I did for my book, and we know that when you're deeply partisan, if you encounter a negative fact, okay, and by negative fact, I mean a fact that would be in opposition to a belief you have. Let's say you believe that there were 10,000 fake ballots in Fulton County, Georgia, and you find out that there were not 10,000. Well, if you're deeply partisan, you experience negative facts as an attack. It triggers a sort of an involuntary, like fight or flight, adrenaline type surge, when you should be grateful. You should be grateful to learn learn the truth. And so we really need to be very careful about that lawyer mindset and that partisan mindset that creates that sort of involuntary urge to defend, to rationalize, to excuse, and sometimes an involuntary urge to attack. As a citizen of a constitutional republic who's tasked with helping select our leaders at all levels of American government and society, we should take a much more of a view that we're like judges or jurors, that we're gathering facts, and that we are trying to discern between competing narratives. That's just a different mindset.
Is there a way to even shift it further to where now we're looking at every election cycle as if it were a trial, and somebody has to win and somebody has to lose, or we're laying over the top of it this competitive mindset that is so pervasive within sports. At the end of the contest, there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser, and there are long-term implications for that. And so we're looking at every election in that context of, are we going to be the winners or the losers? And then the spoils of that victory are going to be long-lasting, or the consequences of the loss. Is there a different way for us to start thinking about particularly political involvement?
Well, yes, 100%. I mean, we have to realize that, and we have to get it here deep in our core. We have to know that God is on the throne. Okay, not Joe Biden, not Donald Trump. God is on the throne. Why do the nations rage? Is a question posed in Scripture. God is on the throne. And so when we understand that God is on the throne, and we're not selecting somebody who truly is look, in many ways, the stakes of our elections are so much lower than the stakes of leader choices in many countries on earth, because our leader is checked in so many different ways by our system. The ability of any given president to end religious liberty, for example, or what some people had said was end America. Our leaders are among the most restrained leaders in the world, restrained by our legal system. Okay, so. But I saw so many Christians sort of take an existential threat view of our political system when it was completely misplaced. And also, we shouldn't ever have an existential threat mindset when approaching the political sphere. We know God is on the throne. We know God protects his people. We know God will sustain his church. We know all of those things. We're taught, if you grew up in Sunday school like I did, you're taught the story of Hezekiah facing the Assyrians. And here's this tiny kingdom of Judah facing a world superpower. And, people are saying, should you go to Egypt and ally with Egypt? And this prophet's saying, nope, don't ally with Egypt, because God's going to deliver his people. And Hezekiah listens to the prophet, and God delivers his people. And we're taught that. And yet we take this mindset that, well, that's fine for Hezekiah facing the Assyrians. It's not fine for Christians facing the Democrats or the Republicans. And so we have to understand that God is on the throne here. And the other thing that we also have to understand is an awful lot of what you're told about the stakes of any political contest are false. They're false, okay? we live in a political an atmosphere of political rhetoric that's constantly catastrophizing everything. So you're being just fed message point after message point after message point that everything is at stake, that this election is going to turn the fate of the nation, and after a while, once you see the pattern, you just can't unsee it. Everything is always an emergency all of the time. When the reality is that what builds and sustains this nation that we can affect as an individual voter is much more our local Bible study. It's much more our local crisis pregnancy center. It's much more our little league. It's much more all of these local institutions and much more our own family, okay? And if you want to look at what has been causing not all American social factors are in decline, or social indicators are in decline right now, but those social indicators that are in decline, many, if not most of them, are related to the fracturing of the little platoons, of the small institutions. There's this very poignant book written many years ago called Bowling Alone.
Yes.
How Americans are fragmenting. We don't belong to these small associations anymore. And if you want to repair a country, you know what matters a heck of a lot more than your individual vote is 1 out of 150 million. Go ahead and vote. Just put it in the right proportion.
Sure.
It's your engagement with your family and your friends and your local community.
Yeah, David Brooks has been talking about trying to reweave society around these local associations, whether they're churches or they're PTAs or they're the Little League, all the things that used to be the mortar holding the bricks together that are just so falling apart on so many levels.
Yeah.
So, well, let me, if I could, ask you to come back over into your legal side for just a little bit, if you would, and ask you to talk a little bit about what your thoughts are relative to the Alito leak, relative to the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade. Let's do some forecasting here just a bit.
Yeah.
Let's, first of all, explain very briefly why the leaked memo does not necessarily constitute the outcome. Just explain that for our listeners first, that this doesn't have to be B, may not become B. Think about Casey as one example. And then let's talk about, if it does, what that actually means for the state of abortion in the country and what we as Christians can do. So talk first of all about the legal process, the finding, the leak versus the actual finding that'll be here this summer.
Yeah, so a leaked opinion does not mean the case is decided. The case is not decided until the opinion is issued. Literally, when it hits that Supreme Court website, when it's read from the bench, say, for example, at a hearing at a Supreme Court, a session of the Supreme Court, that's when a case is decided. And the history of the court is littered with examples of justices changing their minds during this process where drafts are being circulated amongst the justices.
And that's a good thing, right? I mean, that's part of how the collegiality is supposed to work, where they have this opportunity for dialogue and discussion. Yeah.
Yes, that give and take. And the results can be good or bad. I mean, there was a famous 1992 example where Justice Anthony Kennedy changed his mind on abortion in Casey.
And wound up writing the majority opinion on the other side of what he was saying he was going to do. Yeah.
Right. Justice Roberts allegedly, and it's pretty well established, changed his mind on Obamacare. There's some indications that a previous Justice Alito concurring opinion in a case called Fulton v. City of Philadelphia involving religious liberty was originally going to be the majority opinion, but it appears that there were minds changed during the course of the deliberation. So while I think it is likely that the Alito draft, that some version of the Alito draft is going to be the majority opinion, it is not certain. It is not certain. So we just have to wait. I mean, we just have to wait. And the leak will have, we can't really anticipate necessarily what effect the leak will have on the ultimate outcome. My just gut instinct is that it will harden everyone's position in place wherever they are. They're going to stay, and because they don't want to have been bullied or intimidated by the leak one way or the other. So wherever people are right now, is my guess is that's where this comes out. And if it's with the Alito majority opinion that we saw, then that's what it is. If it is not, then we'll find out soon enough.
I'm even seeing one theory that's why it was leaked, is that there was some fear that Kavanaugh or somebody might be waffling a little bit. Ross Douthat this morning in the New York Times argued that might be one reason it was leaked, was to get them hardened, to get them so that we would get the 5-4 that whoever leaked the opinion was hoping would be the actual outcome. as opposed to getting at the other side, which is the other argument, is we're wanting to get at least one to tip.
Right.
And perhaps leaking and the outrage and all of that would cause that. That seemed to me to be pretty implausible that you could tip a Supreme Court justice by virtue, at least I hope not, by virtue of the kind of outrage that might be on the other side of it. So, okay, so let's then assume that the Alito draft becomes some version of reality. So 5-4, Roe falls. What does that mean for abortion in the country?
Okay, so the short answer, if Roe falls, means that abortion then becomes a matter of state law or potentially federal legislation. That's a little more complicated because there are Commerce Clause issues and everything, but we know for sure it becomes a matter of state law. It may also become a matter of federal legislation, but for sure it becomes a matter of state law. And so states have sort of this crazy quilt patchwork of laws all across the country that would then come into play. Now, a bunch of states, the states where most abortions occur in the United States, have state laws that protect abortion. There are many states, actually states where with much lower abortion rates, have laws that are very restrictive or would even ban abortion. And so one of the best estimates, there was a 2019 study done by the Guttmacher Institute that estimated that around 87% of abortions would still take place post-Roe, okay? So you might think, well, wait, if half the states in the union or so, roughly, either ban or dramatically restrict abortion, how is it remotely possible that still 87, 88, 90% of abortions would still take place? Well, it's possible because many of the big states that have higher abortion rates protect abortion rights. Also because people can travel. Also because people have access to what are called chemical abortions, medication abortions.
Right.
And so it becomes very, very difficult to outright ban abortion. How difficult? The abortion rate in 1973, by all available indicators or best available indicators, was higher in 1973 than it is now, when abortion was mostly banned. When abortion was mostly banned in the United States, the abortion rate was higher than it is now. How could that be? Well, it's easy to get an abortion even if the law says you can't. Relatively easy. So the bottom line is, if you want to end abortion, so overturning Roe does not end abortion, okay? If you want to end abortion, there is no way around major culture change. Now, the good news is that culture change has been occurring. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize. The abortion rate peaked around 1980-81. Right after Roe v. Wade, abortion soared. I mean, it just really arced way up. In 1980-81, it peaked. And it's been going down in every presidency since 80. So the abortion rate went down under pro-life Reagan, pro-life Bush, pro-choice Clinton, pro-life Bush, pro-choice Obama. Now, interestingly, under CDC numbers, abortion actually went up under Trump. Now, we don't know for sure if that's the case. We're waiting on some more numbers, so that might change. But at least according to CDC numbers, this shows the power of culture here, because there are a lot of restrictive abortion laws that were passed during the Trump administration by the states, but abortion under CDC under the CDC measures went up. So the culture matters a ton here. So there's no way to sort of say, oh, Roe's overturned, our work is done, right? That's not the case at all. Abortion only ends through major, major culture change, or the continuation of the culture change that's already been going on.
What does that look like, do you think? What are some pieces of that major culture change that's happening and needs to keep on happening?
Yeah, boy, this is super complicated.
Sure.
So some of the culture change is related to contraceptives. In other words, there are fewer unplanned pregnancies. Some of the culture change is related to attitudes to abortion. More people who have unplanned pregnancies carry children to term. So there's this fascinating, just absolutely fascinating Notre Dame study that was done in 2020.
Best study on the subject, I think. Yeah.
They took hundreds of Americans, interviewed them comprehensively about abortion, found a bunch were in support of banning, found a bunch were in support of legalizing abortion through all stages of pregnancy, Most were in the middle somewhere in the middle between those two positions. But this is key, and I'm reading this. None of the Americans we interviewed talked about abortion as a desirable good. So even very pro-choice people did not, in anything you see on Twitter where people are like, shout your abortion or whatever, that is super fringe. Most people do not see abortion as a desirable good. So that's a cultural shift here. And it's one of the reasons why abortion is much less common. Also, there's less teen sex than there used to be. There's less. There was an Atlantic cover story a couple of years ago called "The Sex Recession." There's just less sex than there used to be. So you got tons of different factors coming together. That A means more pregnancies are planned, and B, when pregnancies are not planned, more of those are carried to term.
Right.
And you combine all of those factors together, and that means that abortion is less common than when Roe was decided and abortion was mostly illegal.
And David, would you go so far as to say, in part, that is due to some of the diligent and passionate work of people like in pregnancy centers and
Yes.
and within advocacy and other levels, and certainly the advent of technology like sonograms that have
Yes.
greatly brought into the light the reality of what happens in an abortion, and has in many ways hopefully educated over 50 years since Roe just how bad abortion is on the merits.
Yeah.
And so
It's
all
really
of the
hard.
efforts, all the efforts of pro-life have really made a significant difference.
Oh my gosh, yes. So it's really hard to peg, and I've been wanting Roe overturned my entire adult life. Ever since I knew what Roe was, I wanted it overturned. But if you're looking at this 40-year arc of decreasing abortion rates, it's decreasing rates, that's abortions per women, ratio, abortions per pregnancy, and absolute numbers. So even though America is a much bigger country than it was in 1973 population-wise, or 1980 at the peak, there are many fewer abortions. So you can't really peg that to any specific national political policy because it's gone down through pro-life and pro-choice presidents. However, there's this massive infrastructure that exists of loving, caring Americans who reach out to love moms and their babies. Crisis pregnancy centers are all over the United States of America. I'm a huge believer in the work of crisis pregnancy centers. And so what's happened is churches, crisis pregnancy centers, families, individuals are really stepping up, again, to go back to what we said earlier about the importance of those immediate social connections that you have. They're really stepping up into people's lives. And I've seen the change in my own lifetime. When I was in high school was the late 1980s or the mid 83 to 87. And frankly, it was awful. It was awful. Abortion was a form of birth control. I knew women, I had classmates by the time they were seniors in high school, they'd had 3 abortions. I knew families that when they found out that their daughter was pregnant would immediately pressure their kid to get an abortion. And, you fast forward to my own son's that was a public high school that I graduated from. You fast forward to my own son's public high school experience, totally different culture. Doesn't mean that there weren't abortions. There were abortions, but a completely different cultural approach to it, both at the family level and at the individual level. And that's the work of a lot of heart change. That's the work of a lot of culture change.
Right. So, and kind of tagging on to that, we have this new term that probably came from the left, sex positivity.
Right.
And I listened to one of
euphemisms are so interesting, aren't they? The whole list of them.
Yeah.
But recently caught the Dispatch podcast in which your coworker Sarah Isger did a book review of the book Rethinking Sex that was written by a Washington Post journalist, I believe.
Christine Imba.
Yeah, very interesting conversation. Looks like a very interesting book. But just this idea, and it's very much on my mind. I wrote a doctoral project around this idea about how the church needs to step up its game even more in the area of helping families to be resourced and to be supported and to be guided in the best of biblical sexuality as the sacred approach, which is really what the book Rethinking Sex is really pointing to.
Yeah.
Is the idea of coming back to the sacredness of sex and sexuality, and obviously big issues about identity that flow into this, where there's so much controversy of that. So many people that will listen to this podcast are actively involved in local churches. They are pastors. They are leaders. Many of them at age have come through things like the purity movement and just say or just wait, that kind of
True
thing.
Love Waits.
True Love Waits. That all that kind of thing. Where do you think the church might be able to go in this issue? Obviously, it's upstream from things like abortion.
Yeah.
Where do you think the church can get better at helping believers and families in this area?
Well, I think we have to understand that there is an enormous amount of heartache and misery out there, in part because the sexual revolution in many ways is sort of burning itself out in some really profound ways. So if you would go back in the 1960s and 70s and even into the 80s, you would see a lot of things happening at once. You would see divorce rates climbing as no-fault divorce rates spread like wildfire across the country. Rates of unwed pregnancy, unwed parenting just skyrocketing. As sort of there was this argument. I don't know if you guys remember the whole argument about Murphy Brown. Dan
Quayle.
That single parenting was no different at all from parenting, with a mom and a dad, and so all of these, abortion was skyrocketing. So all of these signifiers that said, "Hey, look, we're going to disconnect sex from marriage. We're going to really disconnect sex from love, that it's just a form of recreation. We're going to disconnect child rearing from marriage." All of that is kind of ending in tears right now. So, and people are adjusting their behavior. So divorce rates are down. More kids are raised with their mom and dad now than used to be. Abortion rates are down. So you have a lot of cultural course correction, and one of the looming cultural course corrections right now is related to sex and porn. There's an entire generation of women and young men who've been deeply damaged by the proliferation of porn, and they're looking for something different. And this is where the Imba book is so powerful. She has this thing that she wrote in the Washington Post where she's talking to all these young women. And one young woman says, "Can't we just love each other for 5 minutes?"
Yeah.
And that's where the church should be sitting there and saying, this is a place where we're centering all this deep connection, this deep intimacy, the matters that are so closely connected to the human heart. We're centering them, completely recentering them away from that sort of atomized existence of pleasure-seeking, indulgent existence, which was been destroying hearts and minds, and centering them around a biblical model that restores hearts and minds and that's rooted and centered and loved. Now, we have to be careful that we don't repeat the errors of the sort of the purity movement, which kind of became a sexual prosperity gospel. That
it's well said.
If you just do A, B, C, and D, then you're going to have the greatest, you're going to be married and you're going to have this incredible sex life in marriage. And no, that's not, you're not centered around that. Or a movement that said, well, if you kiss another man before you're married, then you haven't saved something for your husband and you're tainted in some way. I remember the height of that movement. My wife and I were involved in youth ministry, and 16-year-old girls bawling their eyes out, wondering if they could wear white going down the aisle because they'd kissed a prom date.
Right.
And what? No, that's that kind of legalism. You got to shun that. But recentering people around the love of Christ and recentering, families in that in this entire cultural view that essentially says, no, what we've been doing for so long, it's not working. It hasn't worked. And there are broken hearts out there. And that's why the IMBA book is incredibly powerful, and the church should be right there in the midst of this movement, responding to all of that heartbreak.
Right, and remember contextually, biblically, that's exactly what happened again with the gospel. When the gospel comes in, especially into places like Rome and Corinth, it's walking into a place that is as sexually confused and broken and dark as anything that we've seen, even on a much grander scale, and comes in as this beautiful word of, no, this can be seen in a sacred way. This can be seen in a beautiful way, not as something animalistic or divorced from the most sacred parts of our lives.
Well, and the other, that word love, I think, is really, really important, because what we have to communicate to the culture and what we have to communicate to people is we love them, okay? We love them. And that connects with politics, right? We can't carve out our political presence and say, except when it comes to politics, then we're going to dominate and destroy. But in every other area, we're nice. We're nice people. No. In every area, we have to communicate love and affection for our fellow citizens, for our neighbors, in every area. Because people don't experience us as compartmentalized people. You know, if someone experiences me in politics and I'm a total jerk to them, every person could come up to them and say, well, you really need to know David outside of politics. He's really great outside of politics. Well, they don't know me outside of politics. And so, you know, you don't get to carve this thing out, or you don't get to say, well, I'm an animal in business. But outside of business, you should see me at the soup kitchen. You know, we don't compartmentalize our morality like that.
That's what you're talking about separating Sunday from Monday.
Yeah, in fact, I think that's a great place to close. David, thank you so much for that, and for the way that on such a practical level you're landing us. I think exactly where the gospel wants us to be landed. So my own background is in philosophy of religion. That's my doctorate. That's what I've taught over many years in seminaries and other places. And one of the things out of that I talk about a lot is this Greco-Roman kind of separating the soul and the body. You know, you get this from the Orphic Code up to Plato, and even through Augustine, and even up to today. You've got the Sunday and Monday, spiritual, secular, religion, real world. You get this transactional religion, place a sacrifice on the altar so that God will bless your crops. Go to church on Sunday so God will bless you on Monday. You know, pray so that God will bless your day. Kind of almost using God as a means to my end, and having this compartmentalized life where, well, I know what I have to do, what I have to do in business. You know, but I can still teach my Sunday school class over here, and you know, and you preachers don't live in the real world if you don't know that. You know, I've even had people in the churches I pastor get on these finance committees or these personnel committees and think, you know, my job is to be the hard-nosed businessman the preacher just not willing to be. You know, and so I even bring Monday into Sunday and think I'm doing a good thing.
Yeah, of course.
You know, in this kind of a context, and so whatever it is, whether it's abortion issues or religious liberty issues, I hear you again calling us to holism. Calling us to Jesus' statements, you know, take up your cross daily, and crosses all of you. Be crucified with Christ. Submit, present your body a living sacrifice. Be surrendered to the Spirit on a daily, holistic level. So let me ask you as we close this, if I could, one more question. What makes that so resonant for you? What in your own experience, what in your own faith development has brought you to that place? Because I see that in everything you write. I see that in everything you do. You're the same when you're on a podcast as when you're writing. There's this holism in you. What got you to that place, and how can we learn from that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that got me to this place, quite frankly, was repentance. Because, look, a lot of the things that I talk about when I talk about the problems of the partisan mind, I'm talking about myself. You know, I was a pretty partisan person for a pretty extended period of my life. And I remember right before I deployed to Iraq was a wake-up call for me, by the way, in this sense. I remember right before I deployed to Iraq, I gave a speech at a conservative conference. And I was a religious liberty, pro-life lawyer, and I did that for, 20-plus years. But I was a religious liberty, pro-life lawyer, and someone asked me a question right before I deployed. I was also in the reserves, and he said, why are you leaving? Why'd you volunteer to go to Iraq when you're doing so much good defending liberty here at home? And I, in front of hundreds of conservatives, kind of I had this great line, because I believe the two great threats to America are radical leftists at home and jihadists abroad, and I feel called to fight both. Yay, everyone cheered. And then I go to Iraq and I see what an actual enemy is. I mean, we fought Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was the precursor to ISIS. And everything that you saw ISIS do in 2014, 2015, they were doing in Diyala province in 2007, 2008. It was horrific. It was horrific. I can't even begin to describe the horror of what happened in that region of Iraq. Yet, I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, going to law school. I lived in Ithaca, New York, when it had a socialist mayor. I lived in Midtown Manhattan, in Midtown Manhattan, when it's one of the bluest parts of America. I used to live in Center City, Philly, one of the bluest parts of America. And I had a good life. I went to church. I had friends. And the idea that I would compare in the same sentence these fellow citizens and mention them in the same breath as these people who are beheading children, that's what the jihadists were doing. I just felt this sense of shame, to be honest, that I had let politics grab me so and hold me so tightly that I could say a sentence like that, right? Of course, I didn't say they were exactly the same, but I put them together, and I just felt a sense of shame, and that really started me on a journey away. It was a process away from that partisan mindset. And so when I'm sort of diagnosing the partisan mindset, I'm telling you, I've lived it. I've lived it. And the other thing that happened also is, as I was beginning this journey out of this partisan mindset, I was haunted by this question. Why is it that all of the learned teachers of the law and the learned scholars of Scripture missed Jesus? Not all of them, but I mean the vast majority. Why is it that they missed Jesus when they had studied the coming Messiah their whole lives? And it's because, I think it's pretty clear from Scripture, they had locked in their minds a sort of a political, cultural savior.
No doubt.
They hadn't imagined the Savior who actually came. And I began to ask myself, how much have I locked myself into a view of my role as a Christian and what it means to be a Christian in this country? How much have I locked that into politics? How much have I locked that into power? When Jesus Christ himself came and the first phase of his earthly ministry ended with, 4 or 5 people at his feet at the cross? Yeah. And then even after his resurrection, when he leaves again, he leaves behind not that many people without a clear plan.
Right. Yeah.
And here I am thinking, just focusing so much of my mind on the role of the church in creating a political structure, when that was not Jesus. That wasn't Paul. Really took time to recenter me. It took time to recenter me because I didn't want to become like one of those people who missed Jesus.
Okay, I just wrote down, I've never thought about that before, and I know we have to close. Are we wanting Christ to be like the returning Messiah that he will be one day, rather than the Messiah he was when he came as a suffering servant?
Yeah.
Aren't we wanting Jesus to be today what he will be one day? Revelation 19, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Aren't we wanting him to be that today and missing the Savior he is, the suffering servant that he is and calls us to? I've never had that thought before. I think that's a profoundly convicting question. Yeah. And calls us to the kind of holism that we all need to be about.
Kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Are we hoping for Jesus to show up as the bully that will be on our side?
As long as he's my bully.
Yes, he's my bully.
As long as he's on my side. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
So
profound.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for your time to be a part of this conversation with us. As we said, we're big fans and we'll continue to be. And we just want to thank you for being a part of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for what you did and for who you are. I've taken so many notes here. I'm so grateful. I've learned so much. And I'm just so grateful for doing what you're doing. Please hear us encourage you to keep doing what you're doing and know that we're grateful, and so many of us are grateful as well.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it and really enjoyed the conversation.